Good afternoon and welcome to the ECDataWorks 2021 conference. We are pleased to be able to offer live streams of our keynotes and our panel discussions this week. ECDataWorks is an organization that exists to help states accomplish their early childhood practice and policy goals through innovative use of integrated early childhood data. We do this by partnering with states to build analytics, creating a community of state staff who are working to develop an ECIDS, providing professional development to support the skills and that are needed to develop responsive analytics, and providing content for continued learning through products, podcasts, and blogs. To highlight the work of our partner states and the progress made throughout the country, we host an annual conference to support professional development and community building. This year's conference focuses on building resilient analytics. As state leaders continue to build and ask more of these data systems, we hope that the content presented this week will inform your new approaches to using data and share ideas for how to enhance your current data analytics to inform the ever-changing policy and program questions. The first keynote is both timely and essential to help promote racial equity in early childhood. I'm pleased to introduce our first keynote, Della Jenkins, who will be sharing how to approach centering racial equity across the data lifecycle. Della Jenkins is the Executive Director of Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy at Aisp. She oversees the initiative's strategic partnerships and works to promote data sharing and linkage for public good. In 2019, Della and her colleagues led a diverse work group of civic data stakeholders to co-create strategies to center racial equity in data integration efforts. Prior to joining AISP, Della's experience included child advocacy, policy analysis, and applied mixed methods research spanning birth to post-secondary education. She earned a BA in political science from Georgetown and a master's degree in social policy from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for being here today, Della.
Thank you so much, Missy, for the introduction, and thank you to ECDataWorks for having me, and thank you all for being here and bearing with the technical difficulties. This is COVID life, I guess. So thank you. I am very, very pleased to be here and honored to be kicking off this exciting week. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Executive Director of Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. And as Missy said, we're located at the University of Pennsylvania. So I am here in my lovely basement office in Philadelphia. And I'm just so pleased to be on with people from all over the country who are thinking and living and breathing early childhood data, and who are interested in being part of centering racial equity across the data lifecycle. This is a topic that is uncomfortable sometimes and so important. And it's an area where I'm learning every day alongside the sites we work with. So thank you for being here to learn with me. And I hope, and I'm sure I will also learn from you and from our conversation. So today we are going to, I'll give a brief introduction to AISP. I will talk about how we developed a toolkit for centering racial equity. And then I'll dive into what we learned, some of the promising and problematic practices across the data lifecycle that are important to recognize and to start to think about in your day-to-day practice. And then we're going to have a discussion. I'm really, really pleased to be joined by a surprise special guest who is going to talk about what this looks like in practice for early childhood systems. And then we're going to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat and we will come back to them at that point. And I think Missy is going to help lead us through that. So to get started, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, AISP, is one of the gazillion acronyms you will hear. What's important to know about us is that we work at the same really essential intersection as ECDataWorks, and are so pleased to be a partner, working to help state and local governments collaborate across agencies to use data to improve lives. And that involves sharing and integrating that data. And so how do we do that? We work with ECIDS and IDS more broadly, data collaboratives, whatever they are called. We work with cross-agency collaborations who are working to expand their view to a whole child view, to a whole family view, to a whole ecosystem view. So we know that kids develop in ecosystems in context, and we know that our government systems are siloed and don't make it easy for us to see that context. And that's what we're trying to change together. So how do we approach this question of building integrated data systems and integrated practice? At AISP, we do a number of things. I'm going to kind of gloss through these and get to what's really important, which is how we do all of them. And it's through a network. It's through the 35, actually this says 35, it's 36 now. We're growing all the time. State, city, and counties that we work with who are doing this. And each of them has a slightly different set of partners at the table and different priority policy areas and questions, but all of them are working on this more holistic view and using data to improve lives. And AISP is really a convener, a collaborator. We do consulting and technical assistance, but really what we do is we learn from these people and we lift up their work, allow them to learn from each other and try to make their lives easier. That's our job. So as part of that, we ask the cities and counties in our network and states in our network, what is it that you need from us? Like, what do you need more help with? Sometimes it's legal agreements, right? Sometimes it's learning about new technical tools. It runs the gamut, but as Phil said, it's generally about people more than it is about technology, even though systems sound technical, right? And so a couple years ago, when we asked our network of sites, what is it that you need help with? The answer was, and it wasn't always articulated quite like this, but it was essentially centering racial equity. It was figuring out, how do you do meaningful community engagement? And deeper than that, how do you start to grapple with how to approach the building of data infrastructure and the use of data in a way that acknowledges past harms that have been committed by government agencies, by researchers? How do you begin to acknowledge that those harms are racialized? And how do you begin to build data infrastructure that promotes equity rather than perpetuating the bias that we know is baked into data and that has historically led to inequitable resource distribution, inequitable access, inequitable outcomes? So our sites asked us for help. They said, what can we do? And we looked back to them to learn from what they were doing already. And then we tried really intentionally to broaden the pool of people, the pool of perspectives about how to do this well. And the result is this toolkit. So I hope you all will go check it out. It is a labor of love, took quite a long time to come together. And in it, we try to practice what we're preaching. So because of that, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the process of how it was developed, even though that's probably not the most fun part, but it's really, really important. So this toolkit was developed over the course of 4 years, really. So even though it is very timely, very of this moment, it actually was in development long ago. So back in 2017. So that's the first thing to know, is it was developed thoughtfully over time and released in 2020. And the second thing to know is that it was developed very collaboratively. So we intentionally brought a really diverse group of stakeholders into the table to help us build this toolkit and to author it. So all of the views I expressed today are my own. I can't speak for anyone else, but I share authorship with 15 others. And beyond that, I share conceptual, I'm going to share conceptual stuff today that really came from both the working group members and the sites who are featured in the toolkit. And so the diversity of voices represented here is really important because we were talking to a group where building consensus was hard, and we were employing techniques from public deliberation, from community participatory action strategies. And there were people in the room who are mucking about in data all day, who are evangelists of data, who really wanted to promote data use. And there were people in the room who I would call skeptics, who have seen the negative impacts of irresponsible data use. And we're really coming to this from a place of, I don't know if I want to put my name on this if it's promoting data use at all. And our job was to try to get those voices in conversation, have some core level setting around language, around norms, and to have a conversation that led to something productive. So we're really proud of that process. And I just want to put the names of all of our work group contributors up here so that you can all see all of the people who contributed to this. So I learned from them. I'm continuing to learn from them. And these are our site-based contributors. So throughout the toolkit, what you'll see is that every section has work and actions. These are the people on the ground in agencies who shared what they're doing in practice and who we documented that across the data lifecycle. So all of this is to say, this group came together and we were grappling with a really complex current moment. And the current moment is weird because on the one hand, we have more data than we've ever had before. And we know, or I guess I should say from my perspective, and I have a feeling, judging from the fact that you're here at this conference, that you feel the same way, that having data to inform our decision-making feels like a real improvement on making decisions based on hunches, on making decisions because that's how we've done business in the past in our agency, or on making decisions based on, surveys of a small sample of people and extrapolating that out and thinking we can generalize. Like this is not how we want to be making decisions. At the same time, there's this challenge because we know that data, especially administrative data that we've collected through service provision and then are reusing for analytics, is not perfect. It's not reflective of lived experience. It isn't presented in historical context. It's not always good at distinguishing correlation and causation. And it isn't, just because it's what's collected, necessarily a measurement of even what matters most to us or to other people. And I'm very excited to see that there is another session on Wednesday exactly on this question of measurement and what matters and what we collect and what we don't. So acknowledging all of this, it means that we have to take a step back and face the truth that data is here and we want to use it. It's an asset. And we want to interrogate how we're using it and be really thoughtful about that in order to not contribute to continuing harms that are reflected in data and then perpetuated with data. So we started to think about what we were doing, the project we were engaged in, and we started to reflect on the fact that it's an infrastructure project, right? So in the 1800s, there was this massive infrastructure project in our country around building railroads. And in the 1900s, it was highways. And now the infrastructure that's being built and that you all are contributing to is data infrastructure. And if we look back at history and context, we know that the building of railroads and highways really decimated some communities at the same time as it developed other communities and it brought resources to other communities. And so we really wanted to sit with that and think about, are we developing data infrastructure in a way that is decimating certain communities? We want to acknowledge that there are choices being made in how we use data. We want to make sure that we're co-creating infrastructure with an explicit racial equity lens so that we don't fall into that same trap. So that was our starting point. And we started to think, in order to do that, where, when, how do we center racial equity? And if there's one thing you come away with from this presentation, and I hope that you will because it's in the title, it's that we have to center racial equity throughout the data lifecycle, across the data lifecycle. And we think of that in these 6 phases: planning, collection, data access, the use of algorithms or statistical tools, the data analysis, and the reporting and the dissemination of that data and findings. And so when we asked ourselves this question, where do you have to do this? The answer is everywhere. The answer is there's bias, there's potential bias, there's potential harm in our activities at every single one of these stages. And there are places that we can center equity to mitigate those harms also at every stage of the life cycle. So I'm going to start with planning, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these in too much depth, but when we started to write about the planning phase, it felt really important to acknowledge a few things. And one is that these considerations are relevant if we're starting to plan the creation of data infrastructure, so in ECIDS. And it's also, the questions are also relevant if we're beginning to plan a particular use of data, a new dashboard, a statewide needs assessment, an analysis of any kind, really. And so we started to think, what are the questions that need to come up front? These are questions like, why is the work important? Who does it benefit? Does it benefit different people disproportionately? How can we reduce harm? Acknowledge harm, figure out where the harm's going to be, even if it's unintended, and start to plan to mitigate it. So these are really important foundational questions. But what's missing on this slide, and what's missing when you start with these questions, is who answers those questions. If it's just me, or if it's just you, or if it's just a few people within an agency who are doing the project, oftentimes that limits what we're going to come up with in our answers, right? Both because we're only a few people, and because there isn't a ton of diversity in a lot of our organizations, right? We need to expand who we're hiring into these positions, and we need to expand how we're hearing voices from outside of our organizations in this process. So the toolkit has several pieces. As I said, we have this charge up front around co-creating data infrastructure with an equity lens. We have the data lifecycle itself. And for each of the phases, including planning, we list promising practices and problematic practices, and we lift up work and actions. But we also have these 3 toolkit activities, and they're really relevant, particularly in the planning phase. So I wanna touch on them briefly. So the first is about who should be at the table, who gets to answer those planning questions. And this guides you through kind of who are the stakeholders in your context, identifying where they should be in the process, and how to expand your table, right? The second is about really organizational readiness for the process in general. So when we start to think about having an equity lens, we have to think about, do we have shared language and shared understanding of what we're even talking about? Does our organization have an understanding of the local history of race, the way in which policies locally have been impacted by white supremacy? Have we interrogated that past? And that's all part of toolkit activity 2. And then toolkit activity 3 is about involving the larger table of stakeholders in a conversation about risk and benefit. And we have a matrix in there that we've found helpful in some of those processes. So I hope that you all will go engage with those pieces. Here's a kind of a sampling of what they look like. We tried to make them actionable, and many of them are adapted or completely borrowed, with permission, of course, from some really excellent partner organizations who have done this on the ground in different jurisdictions. So this is an example of the type of table you will then see throughout the toolkit for each of the phases of the data lifecycle, where we have some positive practices and some problematic practices. And I promise you, I'm not going to read you all the text on all of these slides, but I put them here because I think they're really helpful in getting concrete. And the other thing I want to say up front is that I think all of us will likely see ourselves and see our organization on both sides at one point throughout this discussion. So acknowledging from the beginning that this is hard work, that problematic practices don't necessarily or even usually stem from malice, but they are essential to recognize, and we're part of the problem until we start the work of identifying them and changing them. So there's no judgment if you see things in your organization's practice that's on this right side of the spectrum. I do in my own, right? But we have to start by taking responsibility for seeing them and calling them out and thinking about ways to proactively change them. And again, I think the key word here is there are intentional and there are unintentional, and we have to be aware of both. So when it comes to planning, on the left side here, you'll see some of the positive practices, and these are lifted up examples of these in our work and actions, including this first one, which is including diverse perspectives on planning committees. That's a really kind of concrete first step, is having people from outside of the organization be part of governance. And then you'll see there's all different things on this side. Particularly, you'll see the third one where I have this arrow is exactly toolkit activity 2, or yeah, 2, if I'm not getting mixed up, which is really researching and digging into and understanding your local history so that your organization has a shared understanding of what happened in the past and where you're positioned to do this work going forward. On the other side, you'll see some problematic practices. And I think the fourth one down where I have an arrow is kind of interesting because I wouldn't inherently necessarily think of this as a racial equity question, but it's important that in going into a planning process around data infrastructure or around data use, that there's clear expectations about how the data will be used and what they're actually capable of telling us. Because as we said before, data can't tell us everything. And so part of that equity lens is actually starting from what we know and what we don't know, and what we can do and what we're able to do, but the data can't tell us. We have to make those decisions based on other lived experience, based on our organizational ethic, based on our theory of change. That's an important one. In data collection, this may be a little bit further afield for some of you who aren't front lines collecting data, although many of us may have prior roles or at other points in our lives been on the data collecting end of things. But importantly, as we're sitting here potentially making decisions about how to reuse data that's been collected, there's this question of who gets to decide what's collected in the first place. So that's a really important thing to call out, is that including the staff and community stakeholders in defining what's collected is a first step. And interestingly, over here on the right side, you have failure to clearly identify, explain, and document data integrity issues or data quality issues. And this is really important because if we don't, first of all, know ourselves about data integrity or quality issues, and secondly, if we don't document those issues and be transparent about them, we run the risk of analysis that is not only inaccurate, but is replicating a bad narrative and a false narrative, and potentially actually impacting resource allocation and decision making in a way that's inequitable. So I'm going to keep skimming through this because I think the meatiest part of this discussion is going to be after we get through our whole life cycle, and we have so many things on the screen. But I really urge you to go to the toolkit and to sit with these and think about what's on each side of this and where you see yourself now. Do kind of a diagnostic using these tables. So when we look at data access, this is somewhere where we have lots of different things because data access looks different depending on what data we're talking about. Are we talking about open data? Are we talking about restricted data that can be shared but requires legal agreements and strict confidentiality? Are we talking about data that really just shouldn't be shared at all? So we've broken this out, and actually in the toolkit, you'll find a whole section in the beginning around discerning what data should be or can be open, what data is restricted, what that means, and what it means to have data just be unavailable. But I think it's important to call out on the restricted side, which is, when we're talking about ECIDS and data sharing and integration, this is really our world here, is this restricted data that's so valuable, but also we have to be careful with, right? And we have to follow all of the laws and regulations, and also governance and ethical frameworks around how we use it. So it's important to call out here that even decisions about where you post your data access process, how transparent you are about the data request form, who is able to jump through the hoops to get access to the data. These things have equity implications. We don't want only a certain in-group of researchers to have access to our data. That perpetuates a power dynamic that is ultimately harmful. So again, something here that might not face value seem like an equity issue, but absolutely is. And you'll see other things here around, particularly in the open data field, even if we're not talking about restricted data, these questions about narrative, about putting data in context when we put it out there in an open data portal. So you'll see, on the problematic side, using indices or algorithms that have harmful narratives baked in. when we look at algorithms and statistical tools, this is the nexus of where a lot of conversation is happening right now around algorithmic fairness and transparency. And that is super, super important. So I highlight in big orange over here on the right side, this use of black box or proprietary algorithms without any transparency or ability to replicate, to really see if these things are have major disproportionality in how, in one, how accurate they are, and two, and then how the decision making is being made using that tool. But interestingly, over on the left-hand side, and this is something I think really concrete, especially for an early childhood policy audience, we have this consideration around, if we want to think about equity, how do we balance the use of risk and protective factors in an algorithm, right? How do we think about flipping from a deficit lens when we're doing things like thinking about risk assessments? And I think this is a really actionable area for this group, and something that I hope we can explore more. In the analysis phase, again, on the left, a more obvious example is, of course, we all want to be able to disaggregate that data, which comes back to data collection practices, of course. But then you can think also about how to analyze data, disaggregated data, in a way that's intersectional, that's looking at multiple identities, and that's looking at compounding risk and resilience. And then over on the right, this is a practice, the one I've highlighted at the bottom, that I think is, again, less obvious in its equity implications, but really, really important, which is, if we don't build the organizational culture and the leadership buy-in to be making decisions based on the data, we are from the outset doing a disservice and perpetuating inequitable action. So if we're analyzing data, particularly on, the people showing up in the data systems are generally people who are over-surveilled, communities that are over-surveilled. If we are analyzing that data with no intent to drive action, and we can't articulate what the action would be that would benefit those people represented in the data, that is fundamentally an equity issue. So it doesn't seem maybe like a piece of analysis, but it absolutely is, because it's a choice about what you do with that analysis. Finally, when we get to this last phase, we're looking at reporting and disseminating findings. And of course, over on the left, once again, promising practice is more obvious, providing public access to aggregate data, dashboards, and making these accessible in lay language, in visualizations that are easy for lots of different types of stakeholders to use in practice, to use for advocacy, to empower conversation. And then over on the right, we see some of these problematic practices that might be a little less obvious. So for example, when we talk about allowing the data to speak for itself without context or discussion, this is problematic because we don't know, we don't know what people are going to do with that data. And ultimately, as data stewards, we have a responsibility to proactively think about potential harms, whether they're intended or not. And so when allowing data to speak for itself, if that data is then going to be used out of context inaccurately and to promote problematic narratives, then we ourselves have become part of that problem. So I highlight these things because I think that it's important to look at both the most obvious equity issues and opportunities, and also to look at some of the ones that are a little bit more fuzzy, right? Like how we put data, how we present data so that it's not potentially being misused is a way trickier question, right? And it's one that I can't answer for you in a presentation like this, but it's a really important place to just interrogate by yourself, and then in your team, and then with this larger table of stakeholders who are engaged in your EC IDS effort. So I'm gonna stop talking after a lot of talking and just say that I think the biggest takeaway that I hope that you take from this is that there's something that you can do, no matter who you are, no matter what stage of the data lifecycle your project is in, no matter what stage of development your ECIDS is in, no matter how close you are to leadership or how close you are to data, there is something you can do individually, but there's also a way bigger systemic organizational readiness piece. That's a really important place to start. So I hope that you will not feel paralyzed by all of the different things that are laid out in the toolkit. I hope what you'll take away is that it's a lot of different small opportunities to get started. And there's something everyone can do today. So this is the statement that our group of contributors came to about what we are trying to do. We are working to create a new kind of data infrastructure, one that dismantles feedback loops of injustice and instead shares power and knowledge with those who need systems change the most. So I think you all being here is a great first step in answer to this question of will you join us? And I'm really looking forward to more discussion and questions. So instead of doing our reflection now, I'm gonna ask that everyone think about taking a few minutes after the session and between the next thing, when you take a break, when you go get a drink, when you're kind of mulling around your own house, we would be in the conference hallways. Think for a moment and just try to identify and jot down for yourself one promising practice that you have seen, that you've either personally engaged in your work, been proud of being able to be part of, or you've seen happening in your agency, and then something problematic or just challenging that you're dealing with in your context. Because I think that's where we start, is by being really concrete and starting with one thing. So I am going to now introduce our very special surprise discussant and thank her so much for being here with us. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice in the world of early childhood data systems. And I am very pleased to be joined by Mandy Ablinginger, who is the Deputy Director of North Carolina's Early Childhood Foundation. She has over 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit and public sectors focused on kids. And Mandy is going to talk a little bit about the work that's happening in North Carolina and what this toolkit, what the phases of the data lifecycle might look like in practice based on her experience. So Mandy, thank you very much for being here with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Della. Thanks for having me. I feel like you introduced me as the mystery guest and everybody was hoping it was going to be like Ibram Kendi or something, and instead it's me. So, but thanks for having me. I'm excited to be able to tell everybody a little bit about the Pathways to Grade Level Reading Initiative in North Carolina, and also just celebrate this awesome toolkit that Della has put together with her organization. So in 2015 in North Carolina, and I imagine around the country, third grade reading proficiency had become a really hot topic. And Pathways to Grade Level Reading was really created to create a space for North Carolinians to come together around advancing early literacy and third grade reading, but from a birth to 8 whole child cross-sector perspective, rather than focusing all of the state's attention on some imagined silver bullet. You know, we know the data and research show that it's investments in smart policies in a broad cross-sector of areas, including health and development of young children, family supports, early education, that really moves the needle on third grade reading. It's not about that second grade reading program or that really great second grade teacher. Of course that contributes, but that's not the whole thing. So the first step of the Pathways work was really to take that research and translate it into a set of data measures that North Carolinians all together could work on improving. And we called those the Pathways Measures of Success. And this little chart that you can see on your screen is the Pathways data model. And you can see it covers, it's kind of tiny, but it covers all 3 areas there in the center of health and development, supported and supportive families and communities, and high quality birth through 8 learning environments with regular attendance. And it includes 50 to 60 measures that can't all be shown on this one chart, but it's everything from infant birth weight to access to culturally competent early education classrooms to economic supports for families. And all the measures and the research connecting them to third grade reading are laid out in a report on our website, which can be a really great resource if you're trying to set up this connection in your own state. And there's also a data dashboard that shares North Carolina data that's available on all of these measures, disaggregated where possible by race and ethnicity, income, geography, gender, etc. And you can see the websites are there on the slide if that's helpful. So this data framework then sort of became the basis for a policy framework that lays out the expectations that we collectively hold for North Carolina's child and family systems, and then some actions that North Carolina could take to start moving those expectations forward. And those two frameworks, kind of the data arm and the policy arm, became the foundation for the Early Childhood Action Plan in North Carolina put out by Governor Cooper and the Department of Health and Human Services, and state agencies and child advocates are now working to, implement that action plan in the state. And all of the pathways work was done really centering racial equity and family and provider voice as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mandy. Can you talk us through when you were doing this work, in particular, thinking about the phases of the data lifecycle that are laid out in the toolkit and that we just talked through? How did you think about centering racial equity in different places there, and maybe just pick a few to talk us through concretely what you tried to do, what was hard, how it went?
Sure. Yeah, and first, I'd just like to say that this toolkit's amazing, and I wish we had had it when we had started back in 2015, because we would have done a better job. I think we could have been more systematic and comprehensive in our racial equity approach if we had had this great guide. So I really encourage people to dive in because it's a great resource. I think we came to the realization that we needed to center racial equity just by looking at the data. It was clear that almost all of the indicators we were looking at, there were disparities by race and ethnicity, and even the early literacy data itself. So how are kids doing on that third grade reading assessment shows completely unacceptable disparities in North Carolina and in every state in the nation. I think we did a lot of positive practices that are highlighted in the toolkit, and I know we did some of the problematic ones too. So it's definitely a work in progress, just like everybody. I can share just a couple that might be interesting for people. So on the planning kind of data collection in those first few steps on the life cycle that you talked about, a couple that jumped out to me were including diverse perspectives, such as community members with lived experiences and agency staff who understand the data on planning committees, and including agency staff and community stakeholders in defining which data should be collected or used. And there's sort of two examples of this. To start this work, we had a data action team, which was the group who was going to decide, what indicators go into this model and how is it kind of organized and messaged. And we very intentionally built that team, not just with quote data experts, but with parents on the team, B through 5 teachers, birth through 5 teachers, and K through 3rd grade teachers, principal, providers of services for children and families. And I think they really impacted what this ended up looking like. And an example of that is we were discussing using a piece of data that North Carolina has that's it's really a pre-reading assessment for kindergartners, 1st graders, and 2nd graders. And logically you'd think, yeah, I mean, that leads to 3rd grade reading. It's really important to have that data. But the parents and the providers and the teachers really pushed back saying, look, we don't think this assessment is developmentally appropriate for young children. So in effect, it's that, is this good data? Is this data we want to even be sharing? Or is it perpetuating harm to keep putting these kinds of data up? And ultimately, the group decided that they were not going to display that data. And so that was not included in the chart. So it really did come to a different outcome than we would have had if we hadn't had other groups represented, and a much better outcome. Another example of how we're trying to do that, we're kind of staffing an early childhood data advisory council in the state, and we're co-leading that with North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, who of course is our ECDS group, and then the Department of Public Instruction, so our education department. And that the goal of that council is really to create a data development agenda, to look at all of these indicators and see where we know these are all important, where is North Carolina either not collecting the data or just not collecting it very well. Maybe we have a state level number, but we can't disaggregate it, for example, so it's not very helpful. And so that council, we started them by steeping them in a racial equity training with consultants that were brought in so that they would all buy in early and start to understand why we were focusing on racial equity throughout the process, and that was going to be something that was continuously brought up. We gave them like history of racism in America going way back, and then actually had the consultants tailor it to data use. So once again, wish we'd had this toolkit then, because man, we would have made that the basis of our training, and that would be great.
But you did, you were doing it.
Yeah, well, we were doing our best. We were figuring it out as we went. Yeah, so, and then I guess on the kind of other end of your life cycle, where you're kind of into data reporting and dissemination, The ones that popped out for me there were one you mentioned in your talk, so providing public access to aggregate data through dashboards or other accessible reports, acknowledging structural racism or other harms to communities that are embedded in the data, and including stories as a complement to quantitative findings to better contextualize lived experience. We created a data dashboard, and it's this ncpathwaysdata.org link that's on the slide there. And we tried to really think about equity as we created the website itself. So we disaggregated the data and showed that disaggregated wherever possible. We also set up each page the same way so that if we didn't have race data, for example, if the data wasn't disaggregatable that way, there's just a blank spot on the screen that says North Carolina does not collect this data in a way that allows it to be disaggregated by race. And here's why it's really important that we start doing that as a state. So we can kind of use it as a data advocacy tool. We didn't want to try to like hide or gloss over the fact that we didn't have data in certain areas. We also have a why this matters section on each page saying to provide some context for the data points instead of just throwing it up there with no context whatsoever. Users can download the data and the data sources directly from the page. So we tried to make that easy. And then there's also a family voice button that lets you access just a quote, a little bit of qualitative data to kind of put it in context once again. And sometimes that data pushes directly against what the numbers say, which is always really interesting. But it really helps prevent that blame the victim mentality if you can kind of get the context in and help people understand why those disparities might be there. So those were some examples of how we did that. And then I would say we're really working towards others, but we have a long way to go, just like everybody does.
One of your what's been a challenge?
Yeah. I would say we learned a lot of kind of lessons as we went. One thing I would have liked to have done was start from the very beginning of our work in 2015 with the racial equity lens. We a little bit did in that we disaggregated data and we had family and folks on that data action team, but like we didn't have the racial equity trainings in place super early on. We weren't, we didn't have all the pieces in place. That said, I think if you're in the middle of the process and you haven't started with the racial equity lens, it's not the end of the world. Just start now. I loved how you ended your talk. Like there's something you can do today, just get started. I think using great tools like the one you guys have created is a real way to get started on that. And then I think, we spent a lot of time being really uncomfortable. It was myself and another white woman leading the process when we discovered like, oh my goodness, we absolutely have to center racial equity in this work. And we were still learning how to do that. We are still learning. I am still learning how to do that. So we were uncomfortable for that reason. We didn't know whether other people in the group would embrace this racial equity lens. We weren't sure where the work was going, even as we were doing it. So we just were very, very open and vulnerable and kind of stood up and said, look, we're learning too. And we hope you'll come up here and be uncomfortable with us and we'll figure it out together. We also had to really check our own assumptions and biases, which was kind of fun. In terms of how others were going to react to the lens. We had some people who we expected to be obstacles, be like extreme proponents, and some people we expected to be proponents or didn't expect to be obstacles who brought up concerns. So that was interesting. And then I think it took a lot of time. And I think we tend to say, when folks say, oh, we need to have a racial equity lens or we need to center racial equity, immediately you get the like, oh gosh, yeah, we'd love to, but we just really don't have time to do it that way. Or we can't afford it because we'd have to bring in like a consultant to teach people because we don't have that background or we don't have time or money to bring in family members or to pay them to participate. And I think what we found is like, you can't afford not to. That it is such an important piece of coming to an outcome that's successful, that why bother doing the work if you're not taking the time? And like the last step of our pathways process, we took a year. We had 6 meetings over a year because in between them, we were having to build people's knowledge of racial equity and continually remind them to, as our great consultants at Counterpart Consulting said, keep the slippery fish of race on the table, because people would rather talk about anything else because it is an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. And so constantly keeping that on the table and talking about intersectionality. We would have our disability advocates in the room and they would say, but kids with disabilities, like that's the frame we should be using. So we just said, yes, and You know, yes, for kids with disabilities, these things are so much harder. And for Black kids with disabilities, it's that much harder. Like race is always present, it's always acting, and it's a great through thread to focus on. So I would say there were a lot of hard things about it, but we kind of learned to trust the process. We have what we call the messy middle of any kind of facilitated process, where that part in the middle where you feel like it's not coming together and it's not gelling and nobody is really bought in, or different people are bought into different parts, and just kind of trusting that this is long-term, stick to it, and you'll get somewhere good in the end.
I love that. The messy middle. Yeah, we had that. We had that with our toolkit development, and absolutely. And I guess, you know, one thing I'll add is that we're still developing more tools here. We're going to keep iterating on this toolkit and keep adding work and actions. And so to that point, like the work is never done. There was a moment in the middle where I thought, oh, we're never going to have a toolkit at all. And I'm glad that we muddled through it and that we do, but we also plan to have a toolkit 2.0. So I hope people, you know, if you're working on projects that you think are speak to pieces of this data lifecycle, or if you're aware of frameworks or pieces of this that maybe aren't included in the toolkit and you think should be, or you think our language in one part doesn't get it right, you know, we want that feedback and we want to make this better and more useful. So there's actually a link, if you go to the Aisp website to the toolkit page, there's a link to submit feedback or submit new examples or ask questions. And we really welcome that opportunity to keep muddling through and keep strengthening this because we are definitely still learning. So thank you, Mandy, for sharing your vulnerable learning process here. And I think the work you've done is so impressive and really helpful and concrete for others. So with that, I think we will transition to questions, and I'm going to let Missy and Phil lead us through that part. Thank you again.
Thanks, Della. Thanks, Mandy, for being here.